You have in front of you, this is the first lecture of the history series called The Land of Israel Before the State of Israel, from the 19th century until the Declaration of Independence in 1948. You have in front of you a beautiful synagogue, the Hurva synagogue, against the beautiful blue Israeli sky. This is the modern synagogue of Hurva. We will discuss this synagogue in a moment. But this is the synagogue the way it is today. This is the synagogue that all that we had seen until recently, an arch only, reminding us of what the synagogue that existed there used to be. And this is a synagogue that sorry. This is a synagogue that used to be here. And this is the synagogue that unfortunately was destroyed. Our history is going to teach us that we're going to be learning how from this destruction, Hurva means destroyed. The Jewish people in our generation has been able to see the rebuilding of the beautiful synagogue. This is a story about how the Jewish people never left the land of Israel alone, even though we had the majority of the Jewish people outside of the land. A remnant of Jews always remained. In the town of Pekin in the north, in a somewhat nondescript enclave of limestone houses, inhabited by mixed communities of Druze, Arabs, and a few Jews, there is a synagogue with two carved stones in its walls that the residents claim belonged to the original temple of Jerusalem destroyed by the Romans more than 2,000 years before. The Zainati family that worships here traces its origins equally far. This is actually the Zainati family that actually this woman returned after so many riots, and she is part of a family that traces its origin all the way to the, without any stop, being in Israel, in the land of Israel, for 2,000 years. In some way, these people are Arabized. They speak Arabic. They are like Arabs, but they are Jews, to show us that the physical Jewish connection with the land of Israel never expired, never ended. A few thousand Jews somehow remain in the country, heavily taxed, denied the right to visit Jerusalem. The survivors made their homes in Galilee, where they farmed and managed somehow to survive. For 3 centuries after the destruction of the temple, the towns, villages, and farms continued to host Jewish merchants and scholars. It is here that the Palestinian Talmud, the Talmud Yerushalmi, was completed. And during this period, the Jewish population continued to grow beyond the Arab conquest, even in the 7th century. But this promising interlude ended with the Crusades. The arrival of the Crusaders created a violence upon the Holy Land, that many people had to leave. In 1169, a traveler, a Spanish traveler, Benjamin of Tudela, visited the Holy Land, and he found only 1,000 Jewish families still alive there. And although pilgrims of Jews from overseas continued to come, and the immigrants came from everywhere, the community was still very small. One of the greatest diasporas who came into Israel was from Spain. Even before the Inquisition, 5,000 Sephardic Jews came to establish themselves in the Holy Land. And of course, after the Inquisition, another 5,000 came to the Holy Land. The presence of so many Spanish-speaking Jews made and the land of Israel dominated by Sephardic custom until this very day. And in fact, the most popular language in Israel until the 19th century was Ladino. Large numbers of them established themselves in the city of Tzfat, precisely because Tzfat was near the tomb of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the Zohar's author. It is there that we know that the Kabbalists started. It's that there that they actually made the center. Now, after the flowering of the Jewish center in the 16th century, there was even a greater decline because the Ottoman Empire was subjected to many invasions. There was a lot of insecurity, political insecurity. They were not treated well. Jews were poor. In the stratas of society, in this under Ottoman rule, which started in the, as you recall, in the 1500s, the Muslims were on top in society. After came the Jews, after came the Christians, and the Jews were at the bottom, taxed, humiliated, all kinds of regulations against them. And yet they continued to live in Israel. All this started to change briefly at the beginning of the 18th century. In 1697, Yehuda Chassid, with more than 1,000 of his followers, continues to come from Europe, goes through Poland, urging people to go make an aliyah. And he came and was there, arrived in Jerusalem on October 14, 1700. At that time, there were 200 Ashkenazi and about 1,000 Sephardic Jews in the city. And this was supported only by charity from the diaspora. They built a little synagogue, but they had a lot of loans that they took. Our creditors broke into the synagogue when they did not pay, set it on fire, and took over the area. Because the synagogue was destroyed, the area was called the ruins of the synagogue. And that's what is called Churvat. So it's the synagogue of Churvat Yehuda Chassid. This was rebuilt in 1864, becoming the main synagogue in Jerusalem of this Ashkenazim. In the year 1948, during the War of Independence, it was actually destroyed. And we had the ruin until only very recently. This was the first attempt to enter Jerusalem. But it's interesting that because the Ashkenazi community was the one that was owed the money, the Turks did not allow Ashkenazim to settle in Israel for one generation in Jerusalem. So it was only, the synagogue was, the community was only Sephardic. There are some other attempts to settle Jerusalem. For example, there's a community in Constantinople creates a fund to send people to Jerusalem. And then 1740, another great influx of Jews under Rab Chaim Abulafia, the rabbi of Izmirna, who goes into the city of Tiberias. And Tiberias there are four main cities that continue to have the Jewish population throughout the 2,000 years. And those are the four holy cities. Tiberias, where Maimonides is actually buried, and Rabbi Akiva. Tzfat, city of the Kabbalists. Jerusalem, and Hebron, the place of Me'arat HaMachpelah. A little bit about Tiberias. Some Polish Jews settled in the town in the 1780, and the Tiberias suffered the least of rebellions, but there was a major earthquake, and the town was devastated. At the inception of the British Mandate, 1922, the city already had a Jewish majority. So this is the city of Tiberias. In 1742, another great rabbi, Rabbi Chaim Ben Attar, the author of the Or HaChaim, comes from Morocco and brings immigrants from Morocco and Italy. And the majority of them settled in Jerusalem. Although interestingly enough, for a few months, Rabbi Chaim Ben Attar lived in the city of in the town of Peki'in, as we discussed before. So the majority of the issue of the, we call the issue, the Jewish residents of Israel were Sephardim, very few Ashkenazim. And the reason that, as we explained, is that the Turks did not like this Ashkenazi because they owe them money. Finally, in the year 1777, some Hasidim from Lithuania, under the Rabbi Menachem Mendel Vitebsk, come to Yerushalayim. And it's interesting that this Rabbi Menachem Mendel was living in Yerushalayim, and he was still leading his synagogue, even without Zoom, from Israel. He was running the synagogue in Vitebsk in Poland. At the beginning of the 19th century, disciples of the Gra come, of the Vilna Gaon, and these are called the Prushim. So this very day, we have a group of people called the Prushim, and these are the people also in charge very often of the burial projects in Israel. I want to point out, as you see here, that this is what was happening. Rabbis, one after another, come with their congregations. And little by little, they begin to settle, but mainly in Jerusalem or in Sfat. They suffer natural catastrophes, the instability, the political instability of the Ottoman Empire, attacks from the Bedouins, but they remain. Now, I want to point out something about Hebron. Was also a place, it was the state of the patriarchs' tombs, Me'arat HaMachpelah, was dilapidated. It was only during the Ottoman period that it became a little bit nicer. And by 1850, the Jewish population consisted of about 60 Sephardic families, some born in the town, and about Ashkenazi community of 50 families, mainly Polish and Russian. In Hebron, the Lubavitch Hasidic community established a community in 1823. We know that the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Lubavitch dynasty, actually supported that yeshiva, and it's that because of that, as we may recall, that he was suspected of helping Turkey against Poland, and he was arrested for that reason. The Jewish community was suffering a great deal under Hebron because Hebron was a very conservative religious place, very conservative, and therefore a strong tradition of hostility towards the Jews. But the Jewish community was under the French protection until 1914, when actually the English took over. I want to just talk briefly about the city of Tzfat, where again, the majority of the city of Tzfat were Jewish. The population of 15,000 about the 19th century, and showed that there were about 2,600 Jewish families and 21 Muslim households, and only a few Roman Catholic households. And so, of course, Tzfat, we will discuss, Safed will be at a very important place that we will discuss during the War of Independence. So I want to give you a picture of the land of Israel during this period of time. And we have records of several famous travelers who came through this town, to this land. And I want to point that out to you. In 1895, the well-known French writer Pierre Loti visited the Holy Land and wrote of his experience the following: I traveled through sad Galilee in the spring, and I found it silent under an immense shroud of flowers. The showers of April were still falling, and it was still no more than a desert of grasses. The natural fertility of this valley of Israel was actually gone. And it continues. City and palaces have returned to the dust and disappeared. The forest, which once covered the heights of Gilboa, everything has been changed into a melancholy desert of brush and grass. And the same thing on the road from Jerusalem to Damascus went through that place, and the same thing. Mark Twain, in 1867, traveled through Israel, and he traveled from Jerusalem down to Ramleh, and he went through what is called the Bab el Wad, the city, the road that now is a 4-lane divided highway. And this is what he found in 1867. We followed a narrow bridle path for horses, which traveled the bed of the mountain gorges. And when we could get out of the way of the long trains of camels and asses, and we could not suffer the misery of being mashed up against having our legs bruised by the passing fire. There was no place to pass. And then he says about Jaffa, that was also in terrible condition. Haifa was even worse. He said, this land is sterile. Nothing is growing here. And finally, we talk about Jerusalem. And Jerusalem probably is the saddest of all. The worst part of Jerusalem was that people went to the wall, or the Kotel, that today is a beautiful plaza. Then it was a narrow area, very narrow, where people could not stand more than 15, 20 feet from the wall. And then there was the people, the Arab houses were abutting it. And there were very often people went across this wall, laughing at the Jews who were praying with their noses against the wall, crying. And no wonder it was called the Wailing Wall for many years. It's called the Kotel Adma'ot, the wall of tears. It is only now that we call it the Kotel, or the Western Wall. But even in my childhood, I remember it was always called the Wailing Wall. Their tourists used to come to the wall to look at the Jews crying, and they were happy. They enjoyed to see the Jews miserable. And the Christians were telling this is because they didn't recognize Jesus. Judea perdita, Judea is lost. And sometimes they even went with their donkeys and knocked off the Jews who were praying. So this is the story of our 19th century, where people were staying in the land of Israel. They were coming. but they were heavily, heavily taxed, humiliated, and attacked. Nevertheless, something happened in the world, and I want to share with you this concept. And here we're going to come into a fascinating development. While there were Jews all over the world, and we will discuss this in future lectures, today I wanted to concentrate on non-Jews who were interested, became interested in the Holy Land. One of them was, of course, Benjamin Disraeli. In his novel Al Roy, he writes, "You ask me what I wish. My answer is the land of promise." The author Sir Walter Scott presents the exotic heroine of the novel Ivanhoe, Rebecca, about her desire to return to Zion. The same with the British author George Eliot in the famous novel Daniel Deronda. They were interested. They were thinking about the Jews have to return to the land of Israel. This was happening in parallel movement with the Jewish awakening that we will be discussing in other lectures. But today I want to concentrate on these Christians to show the universality of this work. And I want to talk about two interesting people. One is Lawrence Oliphant, a famous British man born in South Africa. He was a traveler, a diplomat, a British intelligence agent, a Christian mystic, and a Christian Zionist. He wrote a famous book, The Land of Gilead. He suggested that he was afraid that Russia intended to conquer the Middle East, so he devised a plan called a Plan for Gilead, under which Britain would plant a Jewish agricultural colony, and this way Britain would protect the Jewish community and will also protect the invasion of the Russians. He enlisted the approval of Disraeli, Prime Minister Disraeli, who was, of course, a supporter of Zionism, and also the novelist George Eliot in her novel Daniel Deronda. Start to investigate what was happening in Palestine to be able to what could be done. So, in one of his travels, he also realized, or he heard about the pogroms in the Russian Empire. In 1880, he visited Poland, and there he saw what was happening with the persecutions, especially pogroms in Russia. And he dreamt of the concept the Jews should go back to the land of Israel, and there they'll be in safety. I want to point out this man, Lawrence Oliphant, and his wife, Alice, were so popular in the Jewish community that even in many homes, there were pictures of him being called another Cyrus. And according to one historian, some of the pictures of Oliphant will be hung right next to the pictures of Montefiore and Baron de Hirsch. Now, the Oliphants actually settled in Palestine, and he traveled through Europe to encourage Jews, especially in Romania, to travel and settle the land of Israel. Oliphant is buried unfortunately in England. But I want to point out that the secretary who traveled with them, who was their translator and given no information, was none other than the author of the national Israeli anthem, the Hatikva, Naftali Tzvi Imber. Naftali Tzvi Imber was a poet, started to write until the age of 10. In fact, he was awarded an award by the Emperor Franz Joseph and his wife, the Queen Elizabeth, And then from the 1880s, he becomes the secretary to Lawrence Oliphant. Just a point about Naftali Imber. He translated several books into Hebrew. He was a very great literary man. Unfortunately, he died penniless in New York City of suffering from alcoholism in 1909. Eventually, he was buried here in Queens Cemetery, Mount Zion, and then he is reinterred later in Har HaMenuchot in Har Nof, in Givat Shaul in Yerushalayim. I want to point out a little bit about the Hatikva, which is so beautiful. He read the Hatikva to residents of Rishon LeZion, some of the early towns, and in 1887, one of the residents of Rehovot, Shmuel Cohen, put the song to the words of the Hatikva. I want to point out, interesting, that the music itself apparently is an old Italian song, which became very famous in many folk songs in Central Europe. Shmuel Cohen thinks that he remembers it as a folk song from Romania. In any case, the song and the words made a tremendous impression on the Jewish community. The Zionist organization originally had made a competition to see which would be the national anthem, and he did not make officially the place, but he was nevertheless sung spontaneously by the Zionist delegates. They say that when Herzl had suggested that they should go to Uganda instead of Palestine, those who opposed vehemently the proposal, they said, no, our only place is Zion. They started to sing the Hatikva in protest. Finally, in 1933, the Hatikva is officially adopted as the anthem of the Zion. And this is a story of Lawrence Oliphant. Another interesting story, just to show you a little bit how people were talking about the land of Israel in the 19th century, is a story of an American, Warder Cresson. Warder Cresson, born in 1860 in Philadelphia, he was a Quaker, and he published a pamphlet in which he was deploring the extravagance of the times, the immorality, and exhorted all Quakers to lead a better life. And in 1840, in Philadelphia, he met Rabbi Isaac Lesser and became deeply interested in Judaism. Cresson was influenced also by the writings of Mordechai Manuel Noach, who had believed that the Jews would soon return to live in Palestine. This is, as we discussed in other classes. In 1844, he sought and got the appointment to be a U.S. consul in Jerusalem, the first U.S. consul in Jerusalem. He converted to Judaism in 1848, and then he returned to Philadelphia to arrange his prior affairs and move permanently to Jerusalem. Unfortunately, due to this time, when he was in the Mikveh Israel synagogue observing observing Jewish law, he was an Orthodox Jew, the family, trying to take his property and money, sued him and to the court to declare him insane. And it's interesting that the judge family on appeal, with hundreds of witnesses were called, and finally the Cresson was discharged, and he was allowed to return to Israel with his property. And this is the story of Warder Cresson. And so the essence of this is to remind us that, number one, the Jews never left Israel. There was always an element of Jewish in all of Israel. And in the main cities, in Tzfat, in Tiberias, in Hebron and Jerusalem, the Jewish presence was the majority. Little by little, continued to come. And the 19th century, we begin to see the revival of this return, first by rabbis in 18th and 19th century Jewish small communities. The world was turning their eyes towards Palestine and to the return of the Jews to Palestine. All along this time, the Jewish thinkers before Herzl were beginning to think on the same way. And the next lecture, we'll be discussing the beginning of the return, which will tell us how the Jewish people started the first colonies, what we call the first Aliyah.